Chapter 11 of Lorna Doone. This is a Liverocks recording. All Liverocks recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit liverocks.org. Recording by Daisy 55. Lorna Doone by R. D. Blackmore. Chapter 11. Tom deserves his supper. "Well done, lad," Mr Faggus said good-naturedly, for all were now gathered round me as I rose from the ground, somewhat tottering and myrrh and crestfallen, but otherwise none the worse, having fallen upon my head, which is of uncommon substance. Nevertheless, John Fry was laughing, so that I longed to clout his ears for him. "Not at all bad work, my boy. We may teach you to ride by and by. I see, though, not to see you stick on so long." "I should have stuck on much longer, sir, if her sides had not been wet. She was so slippery." "Boy, thou art right. She hath given many the slip. Ha, ha! Vex not, Jack, that I laugh at thee. She is like a sweetheart to me, and better than any of 'em did be. It would have gone to my head if thou hadst conquered. None but I can ride my Winnie mare." "Foul shame to thee, then, Tom Faggus," cried mother, coming up suddenly, and speaking so that all were amazed, having never seen her wrathful, "to put my boy across her, as if his life were no more than thine. The only son of his father, an honest man, and a quiet man, not a roystering, drunken robber. A man would have taken thy mad horse and thee, and flung them both into horse pond, and what's more, I'll have it done now, if a hair of his head is injured. Oh, my boy, what could I do without thee? Put up the other arm, Johnny." All the time mother was scolding so, she was feeling me and wiping me, while Faggus tried to look greatly ashamed, having sense of the ways of women. "Oh, only look at his jacket, mother," cried Annie, "and a shilling's worth gone from his small clothes. What care for his clothes, thou goose? Take that and heed thine own a bit." And mother gave Annie a slap which sent her swinging up against Mr Faggus, and he caught her, and kissed, and protected her, and she looked at him very nicely, with great tears in her soft blue eyes. "Oh, fie upon thee," cried mother, being yet more vexed with him because she had beaten Annie. "After all we have done for thee, and saved thy worthless neck, and to try to kill my son for me! Never more shall a horse of thine enter stable here since these be thy returns to me. Small thanks to you, John Fry, I say, and you, Bill Dadds, and you, Jim Slocum, and all the rest of you coward lot. Much you care for your master's son, afraid of that ugly beast yourselves, and you put a boy just breeched upon him." "Wall, missus, what could us do?" began John. "Jem would a go, not with her, Jem. And how was us—" "Jem, indeed, Master John, if you please, to a lad of his years and stature. And now, Tom Faggus, be off, if you please, and think yourself lucky to go. And if ever that horse comes into our yard, I'll hamstring him myself, if none of my cowards dare do it." Everybody looked at my mother. To hear her talk like that, knowing how quiet she was, day by day, and how pleasant to be cheated. And the men began to shoulder their shovels, both so as to be away from her, and to go and tell their wives of it. Winnie too was looking at her, being pointed at so much, and wondering if she had done amiss. And then she came to me and trembled, and stooped her head, and asked my pardon if she had been too proud with me. "Winnie shall stop here to-night," said I, for Tom Faggus still said never a word all the while, but began to buckle his things on, for he knew that women are to be met with wool, as the cannonballs were at the siege of Tiverton Castle. "Mother, I tell you, Winnie shall stop, else I will go away with her. I never knew what it was till now to ride a horse worth riding." "Young man," said Tom Faggus, still preparing sternly to depart, "you know more about a horse than any man on Exmoor. Your mother may be proud of you, but she need have had no fear." "As if I, Tom Faggus, your father's cousin, and the only thing I am proud of, would ever have let you mount my mare, which dukes and princes have vainly sought, except for the courage in your eyes and look of your father about you. I knew you could ride when I saw you, and really you have conquered. But women don't understand us. Good-bye, John. I am proud of you, and I hope to have done you pleasure. And indeed I came full of some courtly tales that would have made your hair stand up. But though not a crust have I tasted this since this time yesterday, having given my meat to a widow. I will go and starve on the moor far sooner than eat the best supper that ever was cooked in a place that has forgotten me." With that he fetched a heavy sigh, as if it had been for my father, and feebly got upon Winnie's back, and she came to say farewell to me. He lifted his hat to my mother, with a glance of sorrow, but never a word, and to me he said, "Open the gate, cousin John, if you please. You have beaten her so, that she cannot leap it, poor thing." But before he was truly gone out of our yard, my mother came softly after him, with her afternoon apron across her eyes, and one hand ready to offer him. Nevertheless, he made as if he had not seen her, though he let his horse go slowly. "Stop, cousin Tom," my mother said, "a word with you before you go." "Why, bless my heart!" Tom Faggus cried, with the form of his countenance so changed, that I verily thought another man must have leaped into his clothes. "Do I see my cousin Sarah? I thought every one was ashamed of me, and afraid to offer me shelter, since I lost my best cousin John Ridd. 'Come here,' you used to say, 'Tom, come here, when you are worried, and my wife shall take good care of you.' 'Yes, dear John,' I used to answer. I know she promised my mother so, but people have taken to think against me, and so might cousin Sarah. Ah, he was a man, if you only heard how he answered me. But let that go. I am nothing now, since the day I lost cousin Ridd." And with that he began to push on again, but mother would not have it so. "Oh, Tom, that was a loss indeed, and I am nothing either. And you should try to allow me, though I never found any one that did." And mother began to cry, though father had been dead so long, and I looked on with a stupid surprise, having stopped from crying long ago. "I can tell you one that will," cried Tom, jumping off Winnie in a trice, and looking kindly at mother. "I can allow for you, cousin Sarah, in everything but one. I am in some ways a bad man myself, but I know the value of a good one. And if you gave me orders, by God," and he shook his fist towards Bagworthy Wood, just heaving up black in the sundown. "Hush, Tom, hush, for God's sake!" And mother meant me, without pointing at me, at least I thought she did, for she ever had weaned me from thoughts of revenge, and even from longings for judgment. "God knows best, boy," she used to say. "Let us wait his time without wishing it." And so, to tell the truth, I did, partly through her teaching, and partly through my own mild temper, and my knowledge that father, after all, was killed because he had thrashed them. Good night, cousin Sarah. Good night, cousin Jack, cried Tom, taking to the mare again. Many a mile I have to ride, and not a bit inside of me. No food or shelter this side of Exmoor, and the night will be black as pitch, I trow. But it serves me right for indulging the lad, being taken with his looks so. Cousin Tom, said mother, and trying to get so that Annie and I could not hear her, it would be a sad and unkinlike thing for you to despise our dwelling house. We cannot entertain you, as the lordly inns on the road do, and we have small change of victuals, but the men will go home, being Saturday, and so you will have the fireside all to yourself and the children. There are some few collops of red deer's flesh, and a ham just down from the chimney, and some dried salmon from Lynmouth Weir, and cold roast pig, and some oysters. And if none of those be to your liking, we could roast 2 woodcocks in half an hour, and Annie would make the toast for 'em. And the good folk made some mistake last week, going up the country, and left a keg of old Holland cordial in the covering of the wood rick, having borrowed our smiler without asking leave. I fear there is something unrighteous about it, but what can a poor widow do? John Fry would have taken it, but for our Jack. Our Jack was a little too sharp for him. Ay, that I was. John Fry had got it, like a billet under his apron, going away in the grey of the morning, as if to kindle his fireplace. "Why, John," I said, "what a heavy log! Let me have one end of it." "Thank ye, Jan, no need for thicey," he answered, turning his back to me. "Wife wanteth a log as will last all day, to kape the cock a zimmerin'." And he banged his gate upon my knees, to make me stop and rub them. "Why, John," I said, "you got a log with round holes in the end of it. Who has been cutting gun wads? Just lift up the apron, or I will." But to return to Tom Faggus, he stopped to sup that night with us, and took a little of everything. A few oysters first, and then dried salmon, and then ham and eggs, done in a small curled rashers, and then a few collops of venison toasted, and next to that a little cold roast pig, and a woodcock on toast to finish with it, before the shilling and hot water. And having changed his wet things first, he seemed to be in fair appetite, and praised Annie's cooking mightily, with a kind of noise like a smack of his lips and a rubbing of his hands together, whenever he could spare them. He had gotten John Fry's best small clothes on, for he said he was not good enough to go into my father's, which mother kept to look at, nor man enough to fill them. And in truth my mother was very glad that he refused, when I offered them. But John was over proud to have it in his power to say that such a famous man had ever dwelt in any clothes of his, and afterwards he made show of them. For Mr Faggus' glory, then though not so great as now it is, was spreading very fast indeed all about our neighbourhood, and even as far as Bridgewater. Tom Faggus was a jovial soul, if ever there has been one, not making bones of little things, not caring to seek evil. There was about him such a love of genuine human nature, that if a traveller said a good thing, he would give him back his purse again. It is true that he took people's money more by force than fraud, and the law, being used to the inverse method, was bitterly moved against him, although he could quote precedent. These things I do not understand, having seen so much of robbery, some legal, some illegal, that I scarcely know, as here we say, one crow's foot from the other. It is beyond me and above me to discuss these subjects, and in truth I love the law right well, when it doth support me, and when I can lay it down to my liking, with prejudice to nobody. Loyal too to the king am I, as behooves churchwarden, and ready to make the best of him as he generally requires. But after all, I could not see, until I grew much older and came to have some property, why Tom Faggus, working hard, was called a robber and a felon of great, while the king, doing nothing at all, as became his dignity, was liegig lord and paramount owner, with everybody to thank him kindly for accepting tribute. For the present, however, I learned nothing more as to what our cousin's profession was, only that my mother seemed frightened, and whispered to him now and then not to talk of something, because of the children being there, whereupon he always nodded with a sage expression, and applied himself to Hollands. "Now let us go and see Winnie, Jack," he said to me after supper. "For the most part I feed her before myself, but she was so hot from the way you drove her. Now she must be grieving for me, and I never let her grieve long." I was too glad to go with him, and Annie came slyly behind us. The filly was walking to and fro on the naked floor of the stable, for he would not let her have any straw until he should make a bed for her, and without so much as a headstall on it, for he would not have her fastened. "Do you take my mare for a dog?" he had said, when John Fry brought him a halter. And now she ran to him like a child, and her great eyes shone at the lanthorn. "Hit me, Jack, and see what she would do. I would not let her hurt thee." He was rubbing her ears all the time he spoke, and she was leaning against him. Then I made believe to strike him, and in a moment she caught me by the waistband, and lifted me clean from the ground, and was casting me down to trample upon me, when he stopped her suddenly. "What you think of that, boy? Have you horse or dog that would do that for you? Yea, and more than she will do. If I were to whistle, by and by, in the tone that tells my danger, she would break this stable door down, and rush into the room to me. Nothing will keep her from me then, stone wall or church tower. Ah, Winnie, Winnie, you little witch, we shall die together." Then he turned away with a joke, and began to feed her nicely, for she was very dainty. Not a husk of oak would she touch that had been under the breath of another horse, however hungry she might be. And with her oats he mixed some powder, fetching it from his saddle-bags. What this was I could not guess, neither would he tell me, but laughed and called it star shavings. He watched her eat every morsel of it, and with 2 or 3 drinks of pure water, ministered between whines, and then he made her bed in a foam I had never seen before, and so we said good night to her. Afterwards, by the fireside, he kept us very merrily, sitting in the great chimney corner, and making us play games with him, and all the while he was smoking tobacco in a manner I never have seen before, not using any pipe for it, but having it rolled in little sticks about as long as my finger, blunt at one end and sharp at the other. The sharp end he would put in his mouth, and lay a brand of wood to the other, and then draw a white cloud of curling smoke, and we never tired of watching him. I wanted him to let me do it, but he said, "No, my son, it is not meant for boys." Then Annie put up her lips and asked, with both hands on his knees, for she had taken to him wonderfully, "Is it meant for girls then, Cousin Tom?" But she had better not have asked, for he gave it to her to try, and she shut both eyes and sucked at it. One breath, however, was quite enough, for it made her cough so violently that Lizzie and I must thump her back until she was almost crying. To atone for that, Cousin Tom set to, and told us whole pages of stories, not about his own doings at all, but strangely enough, They seemed to concern almost every one else we had ever heard of. Without halting once for a word or a deed, his tales flowed onward as freely and brightly as the flames of the wood up the chimney, and with no smaller variety. For he spoke with the voices of 20 people, giving each person the proper manner and the proper place to speak from, so that Annie and Lizzie ran all about, and searched the clock and the linen press. And he changed his face every moment so, and with such power of mimicry, that without so much as a smile of his own, he made even mother laugh so that she broke her new 10-penny waistband. And as for us children, he rolled on the floor, and Betty Muxworthy roared in the wash-up. End of chapter 11. Recording by Daisy 55.
Chapter 12 of Lorna Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Harris. Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 12. A Man Justly Popular. Now although Mr Faggus was so clever and generous and celebrated, I know not whether, upon the whole, we were rather proud of him as a member of our family, or inclined to be ashamed of him. And indeed I think that the sway of the balance hung upon the company we were in. For instance, with the boys at Brendon, for there is no village at Oare, I was exceeding proud to talk of him, and would freely brag of my cousin Tom. But with the rich parsons of the neighbourhood, or the justices, who came round now and then, and were glad to ride up to a warm farmhouse, or even the well-to-do tradesmen of Porlock, in a word, any settled power which was afraid of losing things, with all of them we were very shy of claiming our kinship to that great outlaw. And sure, I should pity as well as condemn him, though our ways in the world were so different, knowing as I do his story, which knowledge, methinks, would often lead us to let alone God's prerogative, judgment, and hold by man's privilege, pity. Not that I would find excuse for Tom's downright dishonesty, which was beyond doubt a disgrace to him, and no credit to his kinfolk, only that it came about without his meaning any harm, or seeing how he took to wrong, yet gradually knowing it. And now, to save any further trouble, and to meet those who disparage him, without allowance for the time or the crosses laid upon him, I will tell the history of him, just as if he were not my cousin, and hoping to be heeded. And I defy any man to say that a word of this is either false, or in any way coloured by family. Much cause he had to be harsh with the world, and yet all acknowledged him very pleasant when a man gave up his money. And often he paid the toll for the carriage coming after him, because he had emptied their pockets, and would not add inconvenience. By trade he had been a blacksmith in the town of Northmolton in Devonshire, a rough rude place at the end of Exmoor, so that many people marvelled if such a man was bred there. Not only could he read and write, but he had solid substance, a piece of land worth £100, and right of common for 200 sheep, and 150 of beasts, lifting up or lying down. And being left an orphan, with all these cares upon him, he began to work right early, and made such a fame at the shoeing of horses, that the farriers of Barham were like to lose their custom. And indeed he won a golden Jacobus for the best shod nag in the north of Devon, and some say that he never was forgiven. As to that I know no more, except that men are jealous. But whether it were that or not, he fell into bitter trouble within a month of his victory, when his trade was growing upon him, and his sweetheart ready to marry him. For he loved a maid of South Molton, a courier's daughter I think she was, and her name was Betsy Paramore, and her father had given consent. And Tom Faggus, wishing to look his best, and be clean of course, had a tailor at work upstairs for him, who had come all the way from Exeter. And Betsy's things were ready too, for which they accused him afterwards, as if he could help that, when suddenly like a thunderbolt a lawyer's writ fell upon him. This was the beginning of a lawsuit with Sir Robert Bampfylde, a gentleman of the neighbourhood, who tried to oust him from his common, and drove his cattle, and harassed them. And by that suit of law poor Tom was ruined altogether, for Sir Robert could pay for much swearing, and then all his goods and his farm were sold up, and even his smithery taken. But he saddled his horse before they could catch him, and rode away to Southmolton, looking more like a madman than a good farrier, as the people said who saw him. But when he arrived there, instead of comfort, they showed him the face of the door alone, for the news of his loss was before him, and Master Paramore was a sound, prudent man, and a high member of the town council. It is said that they even gave him notice to pay for Betsy's wedding clothes, now that he was too poor to marry her. This may be false, and indeed I doubt it, in the first place because Southmolton is a busy place for talking, and in the next, that I do not think the action would have lain at law, especially as the maid lost nothing, but used it all for her wedding next month with Dick Velicott of Mockham. All this was very sore upon Tom, and he took it to heart so grievously that he said, as a better man might have said, being loose of mind and property, "The world hath preyed on me like a wolf. God help me now to prey on the world." And in sooth it did seem, for a while, as if Providence were with him, for he took rare toll on the highway, and his name was soon as good as gold anywhere this side of Bristow. He studied his business by night and by day, with 3 horses all in hard work, until he had made a fine reputation. And then it was competent to him to rest, and he had plenty left for charity. And I ought to say for society too, for he truly loved high society, treating squires and noblemen, who much affected his company, to the very best fare of the hostel. And they say that once the king's justiciaries, being upon circuit, accepted his invitation, declaring merrily that if never true bill had been found against him, mine host should now be qualified to draw one. And so the landlords did, and he always paid them handsomely, so that all of them were kind to him, and contended for his visits. Let it be known in any township that Mr Faggus was taking his leisure at the inn, and straightway all the men flocked thither to drink his health without outlay, and all the women to admire him, while the children were set at the crossroads to give warning of any officers. One of his earliest meetings was with Sir Robert Bampfylde himself, who was riding along the Barham road with only one serving man after him. Tom Faggus put a pistol to his head, being then obliged to be violent, through want of reputation, while the serving man pretended to be a long way round the corner. Then the baronet pulled out his purse, quite trembling in the hurry of his politeness. Tom took the purse, and his ring, and timepiece, and then handed them back with a very low bow, saying that it was against all usage for him to rob a robber. Then he turned to the unfaithful knave, and trounced him right well for his cowardice, and stripped him of all his property. But now Mr Faggus kept only one horse, lest the government should steal them, and that one was the young mare Winnie. How he came by her he never would tell, but I think she was presented to him by a certain colonel, a lover of sport, and very clever in horseflesh, whose life Tom had saved from some gamblers. When I have added that Faggus as yet had never been guilty of bloodshed, for his eyes and the click of his pistol at first, and now his high reputation, made all his wishes respected, and that he never robbed a poor man, neither insulted a woman, but was very good to the church, and of hot patriotic opinions, and full of jest and jollity, I have said as much as is fair for him, and shown why he was so popular. Everybody cursed the Doones, who lived apart disdainfully, but all good people liked Mr Faggus, when he had not robbed them, and many a poor sick man or woman blessed him for other people's money, and all the hostlers, stable boys, and tapsters entirely worshipped him. I have been rather long, and perhaps tedious, in my account of him, lest at any time hereafter his character should be misunderstood, and his good name disparaged. Whereas he was my second cousin, and the lover of but let that bide. 'Tis a melancholy story. He came again about 3 months afterwards, in the beginning of the springtime, and brought me a beautiful new carbine, having learned my love of such things, and my great desire to shoot straight. But mother would not let me have the gun until he averred upon his honour that he had bought it honestly. And so he had, no doubt, so far as it is honest to buy with money acquired rampantly. Scarce could I stop to make my bullets in the mould which came along with it, but must be off to the quarry hill, and new target I had made there. And he taught me then how to ride bright Winnie, who was grown since I had seen her, but remembered me most kindly. After making much of Annie, who had a wondrous liking for him, and he said he was her godfather, but God knows how he could have been, unless they confirmed him precociously, away he went, and young Winnie's side shone like a cherry by candlelight. Now I feel that of those boyish days I have little more to tell, because everything went quietly, as the world for the most part does with us. I began to work at the farm in earnest, and tried to help my mother, and when I remembered Lorna Doone, it seemed no more than the thought of a dream, which I could hardly call to mind. Now who cares to know how many bushels of wheat we grew to the acre, or how the cattle milched till we ate them, or what the turn of the seasons was? But my stupid self seemed like to be the biggest of all the cattle; for having much to look after the sheep, and being always in kind appetite, I grew 4 inches longer in every year of my farming, and a matter of 2 inches wider, until there was no man of my size to be seen elsewhere upon Exmoor. Let that pass. What odds to any how tall or wide I be? There is no Doone's door at Plover's Barrows, and if there were, I could never go through it. They vexed me so much about my size, long before I had completed it, girding at me with paltry jokes, whose wit was good only to stay at home, that I grew shamefaced about the matter, and feared to encounter a looking glass. But mother was very proud, and said she never could have too much of me. The worst of all to make me ashamed of bearing my head so high, a thing I saw no way to help, for I never could hang my chin down, and my back was like a gatepost whenever I tried to bend it, the worst of all was our little Eliza, who never could come to a size herself, though she had the wine from the sacrament at Easter and Allhallowmas, only to be small and skinny, sharp and clever crookedly. Not that her body was out of the straight, being too small for that perhaps, but that her wit was full of corners, jagged and strange and uncomfortable. You never could tell what she might say next, and I like not that kind of women. Now God forgive me for talking so of my own father's daughter, and so much the more by reason that my father could not help it. The right way is to face the matter, and then be sorry for every one. My mother fell grievously on a slide, which John Fry had made nigh the apple room door, and hidden with straw from the stable, to cover his own great idleness. My father laid John's nose on the ice, and kept him warm in spite of it, but it was too late for Eliza. She was born next day with more mind than body, the worst thing that can befall a man. But Annie, my other sister, was now a fine fair girl, beautiful to behold. I could look at her by the fireside for an hour together, when I was not too sleepy, and think of my dear father. And she would do the same thing by me, only wait the between of the blazes. Her hair was done up in a knot behind, but some would fall over her shoulders, and the dancing of the light was sweet to see through a man's eyelashes. There never was a face that showed the light or the shadow of feeling, as if the heart were sun to it, more than our dear Annie's did. To look at her carefully, you might think that she was not dwelling on anything, and then she would know you were looking at her, and those eyes would tell all about it. God knows that I try to be simple enough, to keep to his meaning in me, and not make the worst of his children. Yet often have I been put to shame, and ready to bite my tongue off, after speaking amiss of anybody, and letting out my littleness, when suddenly mine eyes have met the pure soft gaze of Annie. As for the Doones, they were thriving still, and no one to come against them, except indeed by word of mouth, to which they lent no heed whatever. Complaints were made from time to time, both in high and low quarters, as the rank might be of the people robbed, and once or twice in the highest of all, to wit the King himself. But his Majesty made a good joke about it, not meaning any harm, I doubt, and was so much pleased with himself thereupon, that he quite forgave the mischief. Moreover, the main authorities were a long way off, and the Chancellor had no cattle on Exmoor, and as for my Lord the Chief Justice, some rogue had taken his silver spoons, whereupon his lordship swore that never another man would he hang until he had that one by the neck. Therefore the Doones went on as they listed, and none saw fit to meddle with them. For the only man who would have dared to come to close quarters with them, that is to say Tom Faggus, himself was a quarry for the law, if ever it should be unhooded. Moreover, he had transferred his business to the neighbourhood of Wantage, in the county of Berks, where he found the climate drier, also good downs and commons excellent for galloping, and richer yeomen than ours be, and better roads to rob them on. Some folk, who had wiser attended to their own affairs, said that I, being sizable now and able to shoot not badly, ought to do something against those Doones, and show what I was made of. But for a time I was very bashful, shaking when called upon suddenly, and blushing as deep as a maiden. For my strength was not come upon me, and mayhap I had grown in front of it. And again, though I loved my father still, and would fire at a word about him, I saw not how it would do him good for me to harm his injurers. Some races are of a revengeful kind, and will for years pursue their wrong, and sacrifice this world and the next for a moment's foul satisfaction. But methinks this comes of some black blood, perverted and never purified. And I doubt but men of true English birth are stouter than so to be twisted, though some of the women may take that turn, if their own life runs unkindly. Let that pass. I am never good at talking of things beyond me. All I know is, that if I had met the Doone who had killed my father, I would gladly have thrashed him black and blue, supposing I were able, but would never have fired a gun at him, unless he began that game with me, or fell upon more of my family, or were violent among women. And to do them justice, my mother and Annie were equally kind and gentle, but Eliza would flame and grow white with contempt, and not trust herself to speak to us. Now a strange thing came to pass that winter, when I was 21 years old, a very strange thing, which affrighted the rest, and made me feel uncomfortable. Not that there was anything in it, to do harm to any one, only that none could explain it, except by attributing it to the devil. The weather was very mild and open, and scarcely any snow fell; at any rate none lay on the ground, even for an hour, in the highest part of Exmoor, a thing which I knew not before nor since, as long as I can remember. But the nights were wonderfully dark, as though with no stars in the heaven, and all day long the mists were rolling upon the hills and down them, as if the whole land were a wash house. The moorland was full of snipes and teal, and curlews flying and crying, and lapwings flapping heavily, and ravens hovering round dead sheep. Yet no redshanks, nor dottrell, and scarce any golden plovers, of which we have great store generally, but vast lonely birds that cried at night, and moved the whole air with their pinions, yet no man ever saw them. It was dismal as well as dangerous now for any man to go fowling, which of late I loved much in the winter, because the fog would come down so thick that the pan of the gun was reeking, and the fowl out of sight ere the powder kindled, and then the sound of the piece was so dead that the shooter feared harm and glanced over his shoulder. But the danger of course was far less in this than in losing of the track and falling into the mires or over the brim of a precipice. Nevertheless, I must needs go out, being young and very stupid, and feared of being afraid, a fear which a wise man has long cast by, having learned of the manifold dangers which ever and ever encompass us. And beside this folly and wildness of youth, perchance there was something, I know not what, of the joy we have in uncertainty. Mother, in fear of my missing home, though for that matter I could smell supper, when hungry, through 100 lanyards of fog, my dear mother, who thought of me 10 times for one thought about herself, gave orders to ring the great sheep bell, which hung above the pigeon cote, every 10 minutes of the day, and the sound came through the plates of fog, and I was vexed about it like the letters of a copybook. It reminded me, too, of Blundell's bell, and the grief to go into school again. But during those 2 months of fog, for we had it all the winter, the saddest and the heaviest thing was to stand beside the sea, to be upon the beach yourself and see the long waves coming in, to know that they are long waves, but only see a piece of them, and to hear them lifting roundly, swelling over smooth green rocks, plashing down in the hollow corners, but bearing on all the same as ever, soft and sleek and sorrowful, till their little noise is over. One old man who lived at Lynmouth, seeking to be buried there, having been more than half over the world, though shy to speak about it, and fain to come home to his birthplace, this old Will Watcombe, who dwelt by the water, said that our strange winter arose from a thing he called the Gulf Stream, rushing up channel suddenly. He said it was hot water, almost fit for a man to shave with, and it threw all our cold water out, and ruined the fish in the spawning time, and a cold spring would come after it. I was fond of going to Lynmouth on Sunday to hear this old man talk, for sometimes he would discourse with me when nobody else could move him. He told me that this powerful flood set in upon our west so hard sometimes once in 10 years, and sometimes not for 50, and the Lord only knew the sense of it, but that when it came, therewith came warmth and clouds, and fog, and moisture, and nuts, and fruit, and even shells, and all the tides were thrown abroad. As for nuts, he winked a while, and chewed a piece of tobacco, yet did I not comprehend him. Only afterwards I heard that nuts with liquid kernels came, travelling on the Gulf Stream, for never before was known so much foreign cordial landed upon our coast, floating ashore by mistake in the fog, and, what with the tossing and the mist, too much astray to learn its duty. Folk, who are ever too prone to talk, said that Will Watcombe himself knew better than anybody else about this drift of the Gulf Stream, and the places where it would come ashore, and the caves that took the indraught. But De Wychehals, our great magistrate, certified that there was no proof of unlawful importation, neither good cause to suspect it, at a time of Christian charity. And we knew that it was a foul thing for some quarrymen to say that night after night they had been digging a new cellar at Ley Manor, to hold the little marks of respect found in the caverns at high water weed. Let that be, it is none of my business to speak evil of dignities. Duly we common people joked of the Gulp Stream, as we called it. But the thing which astonished and frightened us so was not, I do assure you, the landing of foreign spirits, nor the loom of a lugger at twilight in the gloom of the winter moonrise. That which made us crouch in by the fire, or draw the bedclothes over us, and try to think of something else, was a strange mysterious sound. At grey of night, when the sun was gone, and no red in the west remained, neither were stars forthcoming, suddenly a wailing voice rose along the valleys, and a sound in the air as of people running. It mattered not whether you stood on the moor, or crouched behind rocks away from it, or down among reedy places. All as one the sound would come, now from the heart of the earth beneath, now overhead bearing down on you, and then there was rushing of something by, and melancholy laughter, and the hair of a man would stand on end before he could reason properly. God, in his mercy, knows that I am stupid enough for any man, and very slow of impression, nor ever could bring myself to believe that our Father would let the evil one get the upper hand of us. But when I had heard that sound 3 times, in the lonely gloom of the evening fog, and the cold that followed the lines of air, I was loath to go abroad by night, even so far as the stables, and loved the light of a candle more, and the glow of a fire with company. There were many stories about it, of course, all over the breadth of the moorland; but those who had heard it most often declared that it must be the wail of a woman's voice, and the rustle of robes fleeing horribly, and fiends in the fog going after her. To that, however, I paid no heed, when anybody was with me, only we drew more close together, and barred the doors at sunset. End of chapter 12. Recording by Michelle Harris. Chapter 13 of Lorna Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Harris. Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 13. Master Huckaback Comes In. Mr. Reuben Huckaback, whom many good folk in Dulverton will remember long after my time, was my mother's uncle, being indeed her mother's brother. He owned the very best shop in the town, and did a fine trade in soft ware, especially when the pack horses came safely in at Christmas time. And we being now his only kindred, except indeed his granddaughter, little Ruth Huckaback, of whom no one took any heed, mother beheld it a Christian duty to keep as well as could be with him, both for love of a nice old man, and for the sake of her children. And truly the Dulverton people said that he was the richest man in their town, and could buy up half the county armigers; and if it came to that, they would like to see any man, at Bampton, or Wivilscombe, and you might say almost Taunton, who could put down golden Jacobus and Carolus against him. Now this old gentleman, so they called him according to his money, and I have seen many worse ones, more violent and less wealthy, he must needs come away that time to spend the New Year tide with us; not that he wanted to do it, for he hated country life, but because my mother pressing, as mothers will do, to a good bag of gold, had wrung a promise from him, and the only boast of his life was that never yet had he broken his word, at least since he opened business. Now it pleased God that Christmas time, in spite of all the fogs, to send safe home to Dulverton, and what was more, with their loads quite safe, a goodly string of pack horses. Nearly half of their charge was for Uncle Reuben, and he knew how to make the most of it. Then, having balanced his debits and credits, and set the writs running against defaulters, as behoves a good Christian at Christmas tide, he saddled his horse and rode off towards Oare, with a good stout coat upon him, and leaving Ruth and his headman plenty to do, and little to eat, until they should see him again. It had been settled between us that we should expect him soon after noon on the last day of December. For the Doones, being lazy and fond of bed, as the manner is of dishonest folk, the surest way to escape them was to travel before they were up and about, to wit, in the forenoon of the day. But herein we reckoned without our host; for being in high festivity, as became good Papists, the robbers were too lazy, it seems, to take the trouble of going to bed; and forth they rode on the Old Year morning, not with any view of business, but purely in search of mischief. We had put off our dinner till 1 o'clock, which to me was a sad foregoing; and there was to be a brave supper at 6 of the clock upon New Year's Eve, and the singers to come with their lanthorns, and do it outside the parlour window, and then have hot cup till their heads should go round, after making away with the victuals. For although there was nobody now in our family to be churchwarden of Oare, It was well admitted that we were the people entitled alone to that dignity; and though Nicholas Snowe was in office by name, he managed it only by mother's advice, and a pretty mess he made of it, so that every one longed for a Ridd again as soon as ever I should be old enough. This Nicholas Snowe was to come in the evening, with his 3 tall comely daughters, strapping girls, and well skilled in the dairy; and the story was all over the parish, on a stupid conceit of John Fry's, that I should have been in love with all 3, if there had been but one of them. These Snowes were to come, and come they did, partly because Mr Huckaback liked to see fine young maidens, and partly because none but Nicholas Snowe could smoke a pipe now all around our parts, except of the very high people, whom we durst never invite. And Uncle Ben, as we all knew well, was a great hand at his pipe, and would sit for hours over it, in our warm chimney corner, and never want to say a word, unless it were inside him; only he liked to have somebody there over against him smoking. Now when I came in, before 1 o'clock, after seeing to the cattle, for the day was thicker than ever, and we must keep the cattle close at home, if we wished to see any more of them, I fully expected to find Uncle Ben sitting in the fireplace, lifting one cover and then another, as his favourite manner was, and making sweet mouths over them; for he loved our bacon rarely, and they had no good leeks at Dulverton; and he was a man who always would see his business done himself. But there, instead of my finding him with his quaint dry face pulled out at me, and then shut up sharp, not to be cheated, who should run out but Betty Muxworthy, and poke me with a saucepan lid. "Get out of that now, Betty," I said in my politest manner; for really Betty was now becoming a great domestic evil. She would have her own way so, and of all things the most distressful was for a man to try to reason. "Ziderpress," cried Betty again, for she thought it a fine joke to call me that, because of my size, and my hatred of it; "here be a rare get up anyhow." "A rare good dinner, you mean, Betty. Well, I have a rare good appetite." With that I wanted to go and smell it, and not to stop for Betty. "Troost thee for thissy, Jan Ridd. But thee must keep it bit langer, I reckon. Her bain't coom, Maister Ziderpress. What 'e mak of that now?" "Do you mean to say that Uncle Ben has not arrived yet, Betty?" "Raived? I knows nowt about that, whether a hath or no. Only I tell 'ee her bain't coom. Rackon them Dooneses have gotten." And Betty, who hated Uncle Ben, because he never gave her a groat, and she was not allowed to dine with him, I am sorry to say that Betty Muxworthy grinned all across, and poked me again with the greasy saucepan cover. But I, misliking so to be treated, strode through the kitchen indignantly; for Betty behaved to me even now as if I were only Eliza. "Oh, Johnny, Johnny!" my mother cried, running out of the grand show parlour, where the case of stuffed birds was, and peacock feathers, and the white hare killed by grandfather; "I am so glad you are come at last. There is something sadly amiss, Johnny." Mother had upon her wrist something very wonderful, of the nature of fal lal, as we say, and for which she had an inborn turn, being of good draper family, and polished above the yeomanry. Nevertheless I could never bear it, partly because I felt it to be out of place in our good farmhouse, partly because I hate frippery, partly because it seemed to me to have nothing to do with father, and partly because I never could tell the reason of my hating it. And yet the poor soul had put them on, not to show her hands off, which were above her station, but simply for her children's sake, because Uncle Ben had given them. But another thing, I never could bear for man or woman to call me Johnny, Jack or John, I cared not which; and that was honest enough, and no smallness of me there, I say. "Well, mother, what is the matter then?" "I am sure you need not be angry, Johnny. I only hope it is nothing to grieve about, instead of being angry. You are very sweet tempered, I know, John Ridd, and perhaps a little too sweet at times," here she meant the Snowe girls, and I hanged my head. "But what would you say if the people there," she never would call them Doones, "had gotten your poor Uncle Reuben, horse and Sunday coat and all?" "Why, mother, I should be sorry for them. He would set up a shop by the riverside, and come away with all their money." "That all you have to say, John? And my dinner done to a very turn, and the supper all fit to go down, and no worry, only to eat and be done with it? And all the new plates come from Watchet, with the Watchet blue upon them, at the risk of the lives of everybody, and the copyists from good Aunt Jane for stuffing a curlew with onion before he begins to get cold, and make a woodcock of him, and the way to turn the flap over in the inside of a roasting pig? Well, mother dear, I'm very sorry, but let us have our dinner. You know we promised not to wait for him after 1 o'clock, and you only make us hungry. Everything will be spoiled, mother, and what a pity to think of. After that I will go to seek for him in the thick of the fog, like a needle in a hay band. That is to say, unless you think," for she looked very grave about it, "unless you really think, mother, that I ought to go without dinner." "Oh no, John, I never thought that, thank God. Bless him for my children's appetites. And what is Uncle Ben to them?" So we made a very good dinner indeed, though wishing that he could have some of it, and wondering how much to leave for him. And then, as no sound of his horse had been heard, I set out with my gun to look for him. I followed the track on the side of the hill, from the farmyard, where the sled marks are, for we have no wheels upon Exmoor yet, nor ever shall, I suppose, though a dunderheaded man tried it last winter, and broke his axle piteously, and was nigh to break his neck. And after that I went all along on the ridge of the rabbit cleve, with the brook running thin in the bottom, and then down to the Lynn stream and leaped it, and so up the hill and the moor beyond. The fog hung close all around me then, when I turned the crest of the highland, and the gorse both before and behind me looked like a man crouching down in ambush. But still there was a good cloud of daylight, being scarce 3 of the clock yet, and when a lead of red deer came across, I could tell them from sheep, even now. I was half inclined to shoot at them, for the children did love venison, but they drooped their heads so, and looked so faithful, that it seemed hard measure to do it. If one of them had bolted away, no doubt I had let go at him. After that I kept on the track, trudging very stoutly for nigh upon 3 miles, and my beard, now beginning to grow at some length, was full of great drops and prickly, whereat I was very proud. I had not so much as a dog with me, and the place was unkind and lonesome, and the rolling clouds very desolate. And now if a wild sheep ran across, he was scared at me as an enemy, and I for my part could not tell the meaning of the marks on him. We called all this part Gibbet Moor, not being in our parish, but though there were gibbets enough upon it, most part of the bodies was gone for the value of the chains, they said, and the teaching of young chirurgeons. But of all this I had little fear, being no more a schoolboy now, but a youth well acquaint with Exmoor, and the wise art of the signposts, whereby a man, who barred the road, now opens it up both ways with his finger bones, so far as rogues allow him. My carbine was loaded and freshly primed, and I knew myself to be even now a match in strength for any 2 men of the size around our neighbourhood, except in the Glen Doone. Girt Jan Rid, I was called already, and folk grew feared to wrestle with me, though I was tired of hearing about it, and often longed to be smaller, and most of all upon Sundays, when I had to make way up our little church, and the maidens tittered at me. The soft white mist came thicker around me, as the evening fell, and the peat ricks here and there, and the furze hucks of the summer time, were all out of shape in the twist of it. By and by I began to doubt where I was, or how come there, not having seen a gibbet lately, and then I heard the draught of the wind up a hollow place with rocks to it, and for the first time fear broke out, like cold sweat, upon me. And yet I knew what a fool I was, to fear nothing but a sound. But when I stopped to listen, there was no sound, more than a beating noise, and that was all inside me. Therefore I went on again, making company of myself, and keeping my gun quite ready. Now when I came to an unknown place, where a stone was set up endwise, with a faint red cross upon it, and a polish from some conflict, I gathered my courage to stop and think, having sped on the way too hotly. Against that stone I set my gun, trying my spirit to leave it so, but keeping with half a hand for it. And then what to do next was the wonder. As for finding Uncle Ben, that was his own business, or at any rate his executor's. First I had to find myself, and plentifully would thank God to find myself at home again, for the sake of all our family. The volumes of the mist came rolling at me, like great logs of wood, pillowed out with sleepiness, and between them there was nothing more than waiting for the next one. Then everything went out of sight, and glad was I of the stone behind me and view of mine own shoes. Then a distant noise went by me, as of many horses galloping, and in my fright I set my gun, and said, God send me something to shoot at. Yet nothing came, and my gun fell back, without my will to lower it. But presently, while I was thinking, what a fool I am, arose as if from below my feet, so that the great stone trembled, that long, lamenting, lonesome sound, as of an evil spirit not knowing what to do with it. For the moment I stood like a root, without either hand or foot to help me, and the hair of my head began to crawl, lifting my hat, as a snail lifts his house, and my heart like a shuttle went to and fro. But finding no harm to come of it, neither visible form approaching, I wiped my forehead, and hoped for the best, and resolved to run every step of the way, till I drew our own latch behind me. Yet here again I was disappointed, for no sooner was I come to the crossways by the black pool in the hole, but I heard through the patter of my own feet a rough low sound very close in the fog, as of a hobbled sheep a coughing. I listened, and feared, and yet listened again, though I wanted not to hear it. For being in haste of the homeward road, and all my heart having heels to it, loath I was to stop in the dusk for the sake of an aged wether. Yet partly my love of all animals, and partly my fear of the farmer's disgrace, compelled me to go to the succour, and the noise was coming nearer. A dry short wheezing sound it was, barred with coughs and want of breath, but thus I made the meaning of it. Lord, have mercy upon me, O Lord, upon my soul have mercy. And if I cheated Sam Hicks last week, Lord knowest how well he deserved it, and lied in every stocking's mouth. O Lord, where be I a-going? These words, with many jogs between them, came to me through the darkness, and then a long groan, and a choking. I made towards the sound, as nigh as ever I could guess, and presently was met point blank by the head of a mountain pony. Upon its back lay a man bound down, with his feet on the neck and his head to the tail, and his arms falling down like stirrups. The wild little nag was scared of its life by the unaccustomed burden, and had been tossing and rolling hard, in desire to get ease of it. Before the little horse could turn, I caught him, jaded as he was, by his wet and grizzled forelock, and he saw that it was vain to struggle, but strove to bite me none the less, until I smote him upon the nose. "Good and worthy sir," I said to the man who was riding so roughly, "fear nothing, no harm shall come to thee." "Help, good friend, whoever thou art," he gasped, but could not look at me, because his neck was jerked so. "God hath sent thee, and not to rob me, because it is done already." "What, Uncle Ben!" I cried, letting go the horse in amazement, that the richest man in Dulverton, Uncle Ben, here in this plight! What, Mr. Reuben Huckaback? "An honest hosier and draper, serge and longcloth warehouseman," he groaned from rib to rib, "at the sign of the Gartered Kitten in the loyal town of Dulverton. For God's sake let me down, good fellow, from this accursed marrowbone, and a groat of good money will I pay thee, safe in my house to Dulverton. But take notice that the horse is mine, no less than the nag they robbed from me." "What, Uncle Ben, dost thou not know me, thy dutiful nephew, John Ridd?" Not to make a long story of it, I cut the thongs that bound him, and set him astride on the little horse; but he was too weak to stay so. Therefore I mounted him on my back, turning the horse into horse steps, and leading the pony by the cords which I fastened around his nose, set out for Plover's Barrows. Uncle Ben went fast asleep on my back, being jaded and shaken beyond his strength, for a man of 65, and as soon he felt assured of safety he would talk no more. And to tell the truth, he snored so loudly that I could almost believe that fearful noise in the fog every night came all the way from Dulverton. Now as soon as ever I brought him in, we set him up in the chimney corner, comfortable and handsome, and it was no little delight to me to get him off my back; for, like his fortune, Uncle Ben was of a good round figure. He gave his long coat a shake or two, and he stamped about in the kitchen until he was sure of his whereabouts, and then he fell asleep again until supper should be ready. "He shall marry Ruth," he said by and by to himself, and not to me. "He shall marry Ruth for this, and have my little savings, soon as they be worth the having. Very little as yet, very little indeed, and ever so much gone to day along of them rascal robbers." My mother made a dreadful stir of course about Uncle Ben being in such a plight as this; so I left him to her care and Annie's, and soon they fed him rarely, while I went out to see to the comfort of the captured pony. And in truth he was worth the catching, and served us very well afterwards, though Uncle Ben was inclined to claim him for his business at Dulverton, where they have carts and that like. "But," I said, "you shall have him, sir, and welcome, if you will only ride him home as first I found you riding him." And with that he dropped it. A very strange old man he was, short in his manner, though long of body, glad to do the contrary things to what any one expected of him, and always looking sharp at people, as if he feared to be cheated. This surprised me much at first, because it showed his ignorance of what we farmers are, an upright race, as you may find, scarcely ever cheating indeed, except upon market day, and even then no more than may be helped by reason of buyers expecting it. Now our simple ways were a puzzle to him, as I told him very often; but he only laughed, and rubbed his mouth with the back of his dry shining hand; and I think he shortly began to languish for want of some one to higgle with. I had a great mind to give him the pony, because he thought himself cheated in that case; only he would conclude that I did it with some view to a legacy. Of course the Doones, and nobody else, had robbed good Uncle Reuben; and then they grew sportive, and took his horse, an especially sober nag, and bound the master upon the wild one, for a little change, as they told him. For 2 or 3 hours they had fine enjoyment chasing him through the fog, and making much sport of his groanings; and then waxing hungry they went their way, and left him to opportunity. Now Mr Huckaback, growing able to walk in a few days' time, became thereupon impatient, and could not be brought to understand why he should have been robbed at all. "I have never deserved it," he said to himself, not knowing much of Providence, except with a small p to it; "I have never deserved it, and will not stand it in the name of our Lord the King, not I." At other times he would burst forth thus: "Threescore years and 5 have I lived an honest and laborious life, yet never was I robbed before; and now to be robbed in my old age, to be robbed for the first time now." Thereupon of course we would tell him how truly thankful he ought to be for never having been robbed before, in spite of living so long in this world; and that he was taking a very ungrateful, not to say ungracious, view, in thus repining, and feeling aggrieved; when any one else would have knelt and thanked God for enjoying so long an immunity. But say what we would, it was all as one. Uncle Ben stuck fast to it, that he had nothing to thank God for. End of chapter 13. Recording by Michelle Harris. Chapter 14 of Lorna Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Harris. Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 14. A Motion which ends in a mull. Instead of minding his New Year pudding, Master Huckaback carried on so about his mighty grievance, that at last we began to think there must be something in it after all; especially as he assured us that choice and costly presents for the young people of our household were among the goods divested. But mother told him her children had plenty, and wanted no gold and silver; and little Eliza spoke up and said, "You can give us the pretty things, Uncle Ben, when we come in the summer to see you." Our mother reproved Eliza for this, although it was the heel of her own foot; and then to satisfy our uncle she promised to call Farmer Nicholas Snow to be of our counsel that evening. And if the young maidens would kindly come, without taking thought to smooth themselves, why it would be all the merrier. And who knew but what Uncle Huckaback might bless the day of his robbery, etc., etc., and thorough good honest girls they were, fit helpmates either for shop or farm. All of which was meant for me, but I stuck to my platter and answered not. In the evening Farmer Snow came up, leading his daughters after him like fillies trimmed for a fair; and Uncle Ben, who had not seen them on the night of his mishap, because word had been sent to stop them, was mightily pleased and very pleasant, according to his town-bred ways. The damsels had seen good company, and soon got over their fear of his wealth, and played him a number of merry pranks, which made our mother quite jealous for Annie, who was always shy and diffident. However, when the hot cup was done, and before the mulled wine was ready, we packed all the maidens in the parlour and turned the key upon them, and then we drew near to the kitchen fire to hear Uncle Ben's proposal. Farmer Snow sat up in the corner, caring little to bear about anything, but smoking slowly, and nodding backward like a sheep-dog dreaming. Mother was in the settle, of course, knitting hard, as usual; and Uncle Ben took to a three-legged stool, as if all but that had been thieved from him. Howsoever, he kept his breath from speech, giving privilege, as was due, to mother. "Master Snow, you are well assured," said mother, colouring like the furs as it took the flame and fell over, "that our kinsman here hath received rough harm on his peaceful journey from Dulverton. The times are bad, as we all know well, and there is no sign of bettering them, and if I could see our lord the king, I might say things to move him. Nevertheless, I have had so much of my own account to vex for—" "You are flying out of the subject, Sarah," said Uncle Ben, seeing tears in her eyes, and tired of that matter. "Zettle the preliminaries," spoke Farmer Snow, on appeal from us. "Verst zettle the preliminaries, and then us knows what be driving at." "Preliminaries be damned, sir!" cried Uncle Ben, losing his temper. "What preliminaries were there when I was robbed, I should like to know? Robbed in this parish, as I can prove, to the eternal disgrace of Orr and the scandal of all England. And I hold this parish to answer for it, sir. This parish shall make it good, being a nest of foul thieves as it is. Ay, farmers and yeomen and all of you. I will beggar every man in this parish, if they be not beggars already, ay, and sell your old church up before your eyes, but what I will have back my tarleton, timepiece, saddle, and dovetailed nag." Mother looked at me, and I looked at Farmer Snow, and we all were sorry for Master Huckaback, putting our hands up one to another, that nobody should browbeat him, because we all knew what our parish was, and none the worse for strong language, however rich the man might be. But Uncle Ben took it in a different way. He thought that we were all afraid of him, and that Orr parish was but as Moab or Edom, for him to cast his shoe over. "Nephew Jack," he cried, looking at me when I was thinking what to say, and finding only emptiness, "you are a heavy lout, sir, a bumpkin, a clodhopper, and I shall leave you nothing, unless it be my boots to grease." "Well, uncle," I made answer, "I will grease your boots all the same for that, so long as you be our guest, sir." Now that answer, made without a thought, stood me for 2,000 pounds, as you shall see, by and by, perhaps. "As for the parish," my mother cried, being too hard set to contain herself, "the parish can defend itself, and we may leave it to do so. But our Jack is not like that, sir, and I will not have him spoken of. Leave him, indeed. Who wants you to do more than to leave him alone, sir, as he might have done you the other night, and as no one else would have dared to do? And after that, to think so meanly of me and my children." "Hoity-toity, Sarah. Your children, I suppose, are the same as other people's." "That they are not, and never will be, and you ought to know it, Uncle Reuben, if any one in the world ought. Other people's children." "Well, well," Uncle Reuben answered, "I know very little of children, except my little Ruth, and she is nothing wonderful." "I never said that my children were wonderful, Uncle Ben, nor did I ever think it. But as for being good—" Here mother fetched out her handkerchief, being overcome by our goodness, and I told her, with my hand to my mouth, not to notice him, though he might be worth 10,000 times 10,000 pounds. But Farmer Snow came forward now, for he had some sense sometimes, and he thought it was high time for him to say a word for the parish. "Maister Huckaback," he began, pointing with his pipe at him, the end that was done in sealing wax, "tooching of what you was plaised to zay about this here parish, and no oother, mind me no oother parish but these, I use the vreedom, zur, for to tell 'ee that thee be a liar." Then Farmer Nicholas Snow folded his arms across with the bowl of his pipe on the upper one, and gave me a nod, and then one to mother, to testify how he had done his duty, and recked not what might come of it. However, he got little thanks from us, for the parish was nothing at all to my mother, compared with her children's interests. And I thought it hard that an uncle of mine, and an old man too, should be called a liar by a visitor at our fireplace. For we, in our rude part of the world, counted it one of the worst disgraces that could befall a man, to receive the lie from any one. But Uncle Ben, as it seems, was used to it, in the way of trade, just as people of fashion are, by a style of courtesy. Therefore the old man only looked with pity at Farmer Nicholas, and with a sort of sorrow too, reflecting how much he might have made in a bargain with such a customer, so ignorant and hot-headed. "Now let us bandy words no more," said mother very sweetly. "Nothing is easier than sharp words, except to wish them unspoken, as I do many and many's the time, when I think of my good husband. But now let us hear from Uncle Reuben, what he would have us do to remove this disgrace from amongst us, and to satisfy him of his goods." "I care not for my goods, woman," Master Huckaback answered grandly, "although they were of large value; about them I say nothing. But what I demand is this, the punishment of those scoundrels." "Zober, man, zober," cried Farmer Nicholas. "We be too nigh badgery ood to spake like that of they Dooneses." "Pack of cowards," said Uncle Reuben, looking first at the door, however. "Much chance I see of getting redress from the valour of this Exmoor. And you, Master Snow, the very man whom I looked to raise the country, and take the lead as churchwarden. Why, my youngest shopman would match his ell against you. Pack of cowards," cried Uncle Ben, rising and shaking his lappets at us. "Don't pretend to answer me. Shake you all off, that I do. Nothing more to do with you." We knew it useless to answer him, and conveyed our knowledge to one another, without anything to vex him. However, when the mulled wine was come, and a good deal of it gone, the season being Epiphany, Uncle Reuben began to think that he might have been too hard with us. Moreover, he was beginning now to respect Farmer Nicholas bravely, because of the way he had smoked his pipes, and the little noise made over them. And Lizzie and Annie were doing their best (for now we had let the girls out) to wake more lightsome uproar. Also young Faith Snow was toward to keep the old men's cups aflow, and hansel them to their liking. So at the close of our entertainment, when the girls were gone away to fetch and light their lanthorns, over which they made rare noise, blowing each the others out for counting of the sparks to come, Master Huckaback stood up, without much aid from the crock saw, and looked at mother and all of us. "Let no one leave this place," said he, "until I have said what I want to say, for saving of ill will among us, and growth of cheer and comfort. Maybe I have carried things too far, even to the bounds of churlishness, and beyond the bounds of good manners. I will not unsay one word I have said, having never yet done so in my life, but I would alter the manner of it, and set it forth in this light. If you folks upon Exmoor here are loath and wary at fighting, yet you are brave at better stuff, the best and kindest I ever knew in the matter of feeding." Here he sat down with tears in his eyes, and called for a little mulled bastard. All the maids who were now come back raced to get it for him, but Annie of course was foremost. And herein ended the expedition, a perilous and a great one, against the Doones of Bagworthy, an enterprise over which we had all talked plainly more than was good for us. For my part, I slept well that night, feeling myself at home again, now that the fighting was put aside, and the fear of it turned to the comfort of talking what we would have done. End of chapter 14. Recording by Michelle Harris.
Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 15. Master Huckaback fails of warrant. On the following day, Master Huckaback, with some show of mystery, demanded from my mother an escort into a dangerous part of the world, to which his business compelled him. My mother made answer to this, that he was kindly welcome to take our John Fry with him, at which the good clothier laughed, and said that John was nothing like big enough, but another John must serve his turn, not only for his size, but because, if he was carried away, no stone would be left unturned upon Exmoor, until he should be brought back again. Hereupon my mother grew very pale, and found 50 reasons against my going, each of them weightier than the true one, as Eliza, who was jealous of me, managed to whisper to Annie. On the other hand, I was quite resolved, directly the thing was mentioned, to see Uncle Reuben through with it, and it added much to my self-esteem to be the guard of so rich a man. Therefore I soon persuaded mother, with her head upon my breast, to let me go and trust in God. And after that I was greatly vexed to find that this dangerous enterprise was nothing more than a visit to the Baron de Whichelhouse, to lay an information and sue a warrant against the Doones, and a posse to execute it. Stupid as I always have been, and must ever be, no doubt, I could well have told Uncle Reuben that his journey was no wiser than that of the men of Gotham, that he never would get from Hugh de Whichelhouse a warrant against the Doones; moreover, that if he did get one, his own wig would be singed with it. But for divers reasons I held my peace, partly from youth and modesty, partly from desire to see whatever pleased God I should see, and partly from other causes. We rode by way of Brendon town, Ilford bridge, and Babrook, to avoid the great hill above Lynmouth; and the day being fine and clear again, I laughed in my sleeve at Uncle Reuben for all his fine precautions. When we arrived at Ley Manor, we were shown very civilly into the hall, and refreshed with good ale and collared head, and the back of a Christmas pudding. I had never been under so fine a roof, unless it were of a church, before, and it pleased me greatly to be so kindly entreated by high-born folk. But Uncle Reuben was vexed a little at being set down side by side with a man in a very small way of trade, who was come upon some business there, and who made bold to drink his health after finishing their horns of ale. "Sir," said Uncle Ben, looking at him, "my health would fare much better if you would pay me 3 pounds and 12 shillings, which you have owed me these 5 years back. And now we are met at the Justice's, the opportunity is good, sir." After that we were called to the justice room, where the Baron himself was sitting, with Colonel Harding, another justiciary of the King's peace, to help him. I had seen the Baron de Whichelhouse before, and was not at all afraid of him, having been at school with his son, as he knew, and it made him very kind to me. And indeed he was kind to everybody, and all our people spoke well of him, and so much the more because we knew that the house was in decadence. For the first de Whichelhouse had come from Holland, where he had been a great nobleman some 150 years agone. Being persecuted for his religion, when the Spanish power was everything, he fled to England with all he could save, and bought large estates in Devonshire. Since then his descendants had intermarried with ancient county families, Cotwells, and Marwoods, and Walruns, and Welsers of Pilton, and Chichesters of Hall; and several of the ladies brought them large increase of property. And so about 50 years before the time of which I am writing, there were few names in the west of England thought more of than de Whichelhouse. But now they had lost a great deal of land, and therefore of that which goes with land, as surely as fame belongs to earth, I mean big reputation. How they had lost it none could tell, except that as the first descendants had a manner of amassing, so the later ones were gifted with a power of scattering. Whether this came of good Devonshire blood opening the sluice of low country veins is beyond both my province and my power to inquire. Anyhow, all people loved this last strain of De Whichehalse far more than the name had been liked 100 years agone. Hugh de Whichehalse, a white-haired man of very noble presence, with friendly blue eyes and a sweet smooth forehead, and aquiline nose quite beautiful, as you might expect in a lady of birth, and thin lips curving delicately. This gentleman rose as we entered the room, while Colonel Harding turned on his chair and struck one spur against the other. I am sure that, without knowing aught of either, we must have reverenced more of the two the one who showed respect to us, and yet 9 gentlemen out of 10 make this dull mistake when dealing with the class below them. Uncle Reuben made his very best scrape, and then walked up to the table, trying to look as if he did not know himself to be wealthier than both the gentlemen put together. Of course he was no stranger to them any more than I was, and as it proved afterwards, Colonel Harding owed him a lump of money upon very good security. Of him Uncle Reuben took no notice, but addressed himself to De Whichehalse. The Baron smiled very gently as soon as he learned the cause of this visit, and then he replied quite reasonably: "A warrant against the Doones, Master Huckaback. Which of the Doones, so please you, and the Christian names, what be they?" "My lord, I am not their godfather, and most like they never had any. But we all know old Sir Ensor's name, so that may be no obstacle." "Sir Ensor Doone and his sons, so be it. How many sons, Master Huckaback, and what is the name of each one?" "How can I tell you, my lord, even if I'd known them all as well as my own shop boys? Nevertheless, there were 7 of them, and that should be no obstacle." "A warrant against Sir Ensor Doone and 7 sons of Sir Ensor Doone. Christian names unknown, and doubted if they have any. So far so good, Master Huckaback. I have it all down in writing. Sir Ensor himself was there, of course, as you have given in evidence." "No, no, my lord, I never said that. I never said—" "If he can prove that he was not there, you may be indicted for perjury. But as for those 7 sons of his, of course you can swear they were his sons, and not his nephews or grandchildren, or even no Doones at all." "My lord, I can swear that they were Doones. Moreover, I can pay for any mistake I make. Therein need be no obstacle." "Oh yes, he can pay well enough," said Colonel Harding shortly. "I am heartily glad to hear it," replied the Baron pleasantly, "for it proves after all that this robbery, if robbery there has been, was not so very ruinous. Sometimes people think they are robbed, and then it is very sweet afterwards to find out they have not been so, for it adds to their joy in their property. Now are you quite convinced, good sir, that these people, if there were any, stole or took or even borrowed anything at all from you?" "My lord, do you think that I was drunk?" "Not for a moment, Master Huckaback, although excuse might be made for you at this time of the year. But how did you know that your visitors were of this particular family?" "Because it could be nobody else. Because, in spite of the fog—" "Fog!" cried Colonel Harding sharply. "Fog," said the Baron with emphasis. "Ah, that explains the whole affair. To be sure, now I remember, the weather has been too thick for a man to see the head of his own horse. The Doones, if still there be any Doones, could never have come abroad. That is as sure as simony, Master Huckaback. For your good sake I am heartily glad that this charge has miscarried. I thoroughly understand it now. The fog explains the whole of it." "Go back, my good fellow," said Colonel Harding, "and if the day is clear enough, you will find all your things where you left them. I know from my own experience what it is to be caught in an Exmoor fog." Uncle Reuben by this time was so put out that he hardly knew what he was saying. "My lord, Sir Colonel, is this your justice? If I go to London myself for it, the king shall know how his commission, how a man may be robbed, and the justices prove that he ought to be hanged at back of it, that in his good shire of Somerset—' 'Your pardon a moment, good sir,' De Whichehalse interrupted him; 'but I was about, having heard your case, to mention what need be an obstacle, and I fear would prove a fatal one, even if satisfactory proof were afforded of a felony. The malfeasance, if any, was laid in Somerset; but we, two humble servants of his Majesty, are in commission of his peace for the county of Devon only, and therefore could never deal with it.' 'And why, in the name of God,' cried Uncle Reuben, now carried at last fairly beyond himself, 'why could you not say as much at first, and save me all this waste of time and worry of my temper? Gentlemen, you are all in league, all of you stick together. You think it fair sport for an honest trader, who makes no shams as you do, to be robbed and well nigh murdered, so long as they who did it won the high birthright of felony. If a poor sheep stealer, to save his children from dying of starvation, had dared to look at a 2-month lamb, he would swing on the manor gallows, and all of you cry good riddance. But now, because good birth and bad manners—' Here poor Uncle Ben, not being so strong as before the Doones had played with him, began to foam at the mouth a little, and his tongue went into the hollow where his short grey whiskers were. 'I forget how we came out of it, only I was greatly shocked at bearding of the gentry so, and mother scarce could see her way when I told her all about it. "Depend upon it you were wrong, John," was all I could get out of her, though what had I done but listen and touch my forelock when called upon? John, you may take my word for it, you have not done as you should have done. Your father would have been shocked to think of going to Baron de Whichehalse, and in his own house insulting him. And yet it was very brave of you, John, just like you all over. And as none of the men are here, dear John, I am proud of you for doing it.' All throughout the homeward road Uncle Ben had been very silent, feeling much displeased with himself, and still more so with other people. But before he went to bed that night, he just said to me, 'Nephew Jack, you have not behaved so badly as the rest to me, and because you have no gift of talking, I think that I may trust you. Now mark my words, this villain job shall not have ending here. I have another card to play.' 'You mean, sir, I suppose, that you will go to the justices of this shire, Squire Maunder and Sir Richard Blewett, or—' 'Oaf, I meant nothing of the sort. They would only make a laughing stock, as those Devonshire people did, of me. No, I will go to the king himself, or a man who is bigger than the king, and to whom I have ready access. I will not tell thee his name at present, only if thou art brought before him, never wilt thou forget it.' That was true enough, by the by, as I discovered afterwards, for the man he meant was Judge Jeffreys. 'And when are you likely to see him, sir?' 'Maybe in the spring, maybe not till summer, for I cannot go to London on purpose, but when my business takes me there. Only remember my words, Jack, and when you see the man I mean, look straight at him and tell no lie. He will make some of your zany squires shake in their shoes, I reckon. Now, I have been in this lonely hole far longer than I intended, by reason of this outrage, yet I will stay here one day more upon a certain condition.' 'Upon what condition, Uncle Ben? I grieve that you find it so lonely. We will have Farmer Nicholas up again, and the singers, and the fashionable milkmaids. I thank you, let me be. The wenches are too loud for me. Your Nanny is enough. Nanny is a good child, and she shall come and visit me.' Uncle Reuben would always call her Nanny. He said that Annie was too fine and Frenchified for us. 'But my condition is this, Jack, that you shall guide me to morrow, without a word to anyone, to a place where I may well descry the dwelling of those scoundrel Doones, and learn the best way to get at them when the time shall come. Can you do this for me? I will pay you well, boy.' I promised very readily to do my best to serve him, but of course would take no money for it, not being so poor as that came to. Accordingly, on the day following, I managed to get the men at work on the other side of the farm, especially that inquisitive and busybody, John Fry, who would pry out almost anything for the pleasure of telling his wife. And then, with Uncle Reuben mounted on my ancient Peggy, I made foot for the westward, directly after breakfast. Uncle Ben refused to go unless I would take a loaded gun, and indeed it was always wise to do so in those days of turbulence, and none the less because of late more than usual of our sheep had left their skins behind them. This, as I need hardly say, was not to be charged to the appetite of the Doones, for they always said that they were not butchers, although upon that subject might well be two opinions, and their practice was to make the shepherds kill and skin and quarter for them, and sometimes carry to the Doone gate the prime among the fatlings, for fear of any bruising, which spoils the look at table. But the worst of it was that ignorant folk, unaware of their fastidiousness, scored to them the sheep they lost by lower born marauders, and so were afraid to speak of it. And the issue of this error was that a farmer with 500 or 600 sheep could never command on his wedding day a prime saddle of mutton for dinner. To return now to my Uncle Ben, and indeed he would not let me go more than 3 lanyards from him. There was very little said between us along the lane and across the hill, although the day was pleasant. I could see that he was half amiss with his mind about the business, and not so full of security as an elderly man should keep himself. Therefore out I spake, and said, 'Uncle Reuben, have no fear. I know every inch of the ground, sir, and there is no danger nigh us.' 'Fear, boy? Who ever thought of fear? 'Tis the last thing that came across me. Pretty things, these primroses.' At once I thought of Lorna Doone, the little maid of 6 years back, and how my fancy went with her. Could Lorna ever think of me? Was I not a lout gone by, only fit for loach sticking? Had I ever seen a face fit to think of near her? The sudden flash, the quickness, the bright desire to know one's heart, and not withhold her own from it, the soft withdrawal of rich eyes, the longing to love somebody, anybody, anything, not imbrued with wickedness. My uncle interrupted me, misliking so much silence now, with the naked woods falling over us. For we were come to Bagworthy Forest, the blackest and the loneliest place of all that keep the sun out. Even now in winter time, with most of the wood unriddled, and the rest of it pinched brown, it hung around us like a cloak containing little comfort. I kept quite close to Peggy's head, and Peggy kept quite close to me, and pricked her ears at everything. However, we saw nothing there, except a few old owls and hawks, and a magpie sitting all alone, until we came to the bank of the hill, where the pony could not climb it. Uncle Ben was very loath to get off, because the pony seemed company, and he thought he could gallop away on her if the worst came to the worst. But I persuaded him that now he must go to the end of it. Therefore he made Peggy fast, in a place where he could find her, and speaking cheerfully, as if there was nothing to be afraid of, he took his staff, and I my gun, to climb the thick ascent. There was now no path of any kind, which added to our courage all it lessened of our comfort, because it proved that the robbers were not in the habit of passing there. And we knew that we could not go astray so long as we breasted the hill before us, inasmuch as it formed the rampart or side fence of Glen Doone. But in truth I used the right word there for the manner of our ascent, for the ground came forth so steep against us, and withal so woody, that to make any way we must throw ourselves forward, and labour as at a breast plough. Rough and loamy rungs of oak root bulged here and there above our heads. Briars needs must speak with us, using more of tooth than tongue, and sometimes bulks of rugged stone, like great sheep, stood across us. At last, though very loath to do it, I was forced to leave my gun behind, because I required one hand to drag myself up the difficulty, and one to help Uncle Reuben. And so at last we gained the top, and looked forth the edge of the forest, where the ground was very stony, and like the crest of a quarry. And no more trees between us and the brink of cliff below, 300 yards below it might be, all strong slope and gliddery. And now, for the first time, I was amazed at the appearance of the Doone stronghold, and understood its nature. For when I had been even in the valley, and climbed the cliffs to escape from it, about 7 years agone, I was no more than a stripling boy, noting little as boys do, except for their present purpose, and even that soon done with. But now, what with the fame of the Doones, and my own recollections, and Uncle Ben's insistence, all my attention was brought forth, and the end was simple astonishment. The chine of highland whereon we stood curved to the right and left of us, keeping about the same elevation, and crowned with trees and brushwood. At about half a mile in front of us, but looking as if we could throw a stone to strike any man upon it, another crest, just like our own, bowed round to meet it, but failed by reason of two narrow clefts, of which we could only see the brink. One of these clefts was the Doone gate, with a portcullis of rock above it, and the other was the chasm by which I had once made entrance. Betwixt them, where the hills fell back, as in a perfect oval, traversed by the winding water, lay a bright green valley, rimmed with sheer black rock, and seeming to have sunken bodily from the bleak rough heights above. It looked as if no frost could enter, neither wind go ruffling, only spring and hope and comfort breathe to one another. Even now the rays of sunshine dwelt and fell back on one another, whenever the clouds lifted, and the pale blue glimpse of the growing day seemed to find young encouragement. But for all that, Uncle Reuben was none the worse nor better. He looked down into Glen Doone first, and sniffed as if he were smelling it, like a sample of goods from a wholesale house, and then he looked at the hills over yonder, and then he stared at me. "See what a pack of fools they be?" "Of course I do, Uncle Ben." "All rogues are fools," was my first copy, beginning of the alphabet. "Pack of stuff, lad, though true enough, and very good for young people. But see you not how this great Doone Valley may be taken in half an hour?" "Yes, to be sure I do, uncle, if they like to give it up, I mean." "3 culverins in yonder hill, and 3 on the top of this one, and we have them under a pestle. Ah, I have seen the wars, my lad, from Kyneton up to Naseby, and I might have been a general now, if they'd taken my advice." But I was not attending to him, being drawn away on a sudden by a sight which never struck the sharp eyes of our general. For I had long ago descried that little opening in the cliff through which I made my exit, as before related, on the other side of the valley. No bigger than a rabbit hole it seemed from where we stood, and yet of all the scene before me, that, from my remembrance perhaps, had the most attraction. Now gazing at it with full thought of all that it had cost me, I saw a little figure come and pause and pass into it. Something very light and white, nimble, smooth, and elegant, gone almost before I knew that any one had been there. And yet my heart came to my ribs, and all my blood was in my face, and pride within me fought with shame, and vanity with self-contempt. For though 7 years were gone, and I from my boyhood come to manhood, and all must have forgotten me, and I had half forgotten, at that moment, once for all, I felt that I was face to face with fate, however poor it might be, weal or woe, in Lorna Doone. End of chapter 15. Recording by Rachel Linton, Bristol, UK.